Hi, everyone. Welcome to Genres 2. Today's lecture is going to be on pastoral care manuscripts and is going to be a pretty quick, relatively speaking, as in quick hit overview into pastoral care as a genre and the very different kinds of manuscripts, but all very related to each other. But the very different kinds of manuscripts that were created in order to support pastoral care initiatives. And we'll talk a little bit about what pastoral care actually means and how broad a topic or a genre this actually is, and we'll get a little bit into kind of the backgrounds behind the rise in pastoral care as the Middle Ages progresses and the need for distinct patterns of bookmaking and distinct types of books that arose in direct response to the growth in pastoral care across the medieval period. So I am going to share my PowerPoint as usual here. And let me get this started here. Bear with me. And go from the beginning here. All right. Sometimes it takes a few clicks. Okay, so why are we going to talk about pastoral care manuscripts? If you were to ask a room full of 100 medievalists what genres of manuscripts might actually fall into a general survey course on the history and the development of medieval manuscripts and manuscript culture, I'm not quite sure scientifically what the proportion would be of teachers or scholars who would come up with an answer like pastoral care. But here at OSU, when I first started teaching this course, pastoral care manuscripts emerged to me as a very obvious choice. Bibles, the last lecture makes really good sense because the Bible is at the foundation of so many things. Pastoral care, I really believe is a suitable topic for us to really consider here for a number of reasons, all outlined here on our slide. Number one, by far, if OSU can be said to have any single particular strength in its medieval manuscripts collection, particularly in its collection of codices, it would be in our pastoral care manuscripts. Of the 56 or so codices that we currently own, at least 24 to 26 of those deal with pastoral care. So we have a nice critical mass of materials here in this field. And it's a fairly broadly defined group of things, but all serving pastoral needs. And what I mean by pastoral needs are those things that were part and parcel of the ministration of priests to lay people. So the education of basic Christian morals and Christian concepts, and all of the knowledge that undergird things like confessional practice and basically things that paved the way from one's life to one's eternal life and salvation after death. We'll get into further detail about this as this lecture continues. But I wanted to create a lecture on this topic simply because, in part because of the strength of our collections. If you as students are going to continue to interact with our collections over the course of your time at Ohio State, chances are you're going to be working with a pastoral care manuscript at some point. Second, while people might not immediately jump to pastoral care as a term to describe one of the most dominant genres in medieval manuscript production and use, it very much is. It is one of the most far-reaching genres when we think about it broadly. A lot of people, when asking, oh, what kind of genre do you think is really important, might say things like sermon manuscripts, confessional guides, handbooks to the Mass, handbooks to the sacraments for priests. All of those might be correct, and all of them indeed were very popular texts. They are all part of what is called pastoralia, the broader genre of pastoral care. So we need to think very broadly when we're thinking about the kinds of things that supported the work between the church and the people that the church was supposed to serve and save. Another reason that pastoral care manuscripts are particularly important is that they can be both Latin and vernacular in scope. Pastoralia was a big field that on the Latin side dealt with international communities and with the official language of the church. So basic principles, orthodox approaches, to the Bible, orthodox approaches to theology and canon law, for instance. These things were written down in Latin and transmitted to international clerical and scholarly audiences via Latin. But then you have to think about how that material was translated from a Latin language into all of the various vernaculars that most of the people around Europe would have been conversant in. most folks listening to sermons in a, at a preaching cross in a town square in the mid 15th century in Italy or in England weren't going to understand the Latin. They needed that information conveyed to them in English or Italian or French or the various dialects of German that were being spoken. So you've got the same kind of content that can be packaged in different languages or adapted from one to the other. The other thing that I love about a lot of pastoral care manuscripts, and this is particularly in the realm of sermon manuscripts, is that you can get very linguistically complex and fascinating texts. They're called macaronic texts. And these are multilingual texts or bilingual texts in which you have multiple languages, but it's not that you have, say, a line in Latin and then explication in the vernacular. These are texts, macaronic texts are texts where you code switch in the midst of syntactical units. So you can transition in the delivery or the writing down of things like sermons. You can move from the Latin to the Middle English and back to the Latin and still convey meaning. So we have some manuscripts that convey that kind of linguistic complexity. It's really, really fascinating. Additionally, pastoral care manuscripts, as I touched on before, are multidisciplinary in scope and content. So they can deal with the Bible, they can deal with high theological thought, they can deal with the liturgy and the practice of delivering the Mass and sitting there and receiving the sacraments. They can be legal. As we'll see, confessional guides are highly, highly legal texts and treatises. They can address concepts like the liberal arts, grammar and rhetoric, music. All of these things play into pastoral care. They can be scientific and literary. They can touch on folklore. All of these things wind up touching upon pastoral care in terms of principally things like sermon exempla. So illustrative stories and moral stories that are inserted into sermon narratives in order to provide both entertainment and teaching. And then finally, for our purposes, really specifically in this course, pastoral care manuscripts are great in that they demonstrate the evolution of medieval book production. The use of books, the production of use, the reading of books, the packaging of books. So especially paratextual elements. All of these things that we now take for granted today when we open up, say, something like the Clemens and Graham textbook that we've been using, the table of contents, the index, citations of authority in the bibliography, footnotes. All of these are developments of the 13th century and really the pastoral care and the biblical scholarship revolutions that happened during that period. So we're looking at these things for this kind of manuscript for all of these reasons. So there are all sorts of underlying factors that led to the development, the evolution, the proliferation of pastoral care as a practice, broadly speaking, as well as the production of books to support that. But for our purposes, I really want to touch on three principal catalysts for the pastoral care revolution. And like a lot of the lectures that you've gotten this semester so far, really every single one of the slides that follows could be the subject not just of their own lecture, but indeed their own courses. And there have been so many books and articles that have been written on all of these topics. If you're interested in exploring any of these in more detail, please contact me and I can provide you with some really good recommendations on things to read about these different developments. So the primary catalyst for pastoral care revolution number one that I want to talk about, and I'll read this here at the top. You're going to have some text-heavy slides coming up, and that is good because you'll be able to come back and review. So the first catalyst is this development of a new intellectual culture, really beginning in the late 11th century, but really picking up speed in the 12th century, and the new ways of disseminating texts that grew out of it. So again, look for, if you really want to dig into this, look for anything related to theology and law, for instance, under the keywords the 12th century Renaissance. I'm not telling you to do that, but if you go to a database of articles like the International Medieval Bibliography, which we have access to here at OSU, you will find dozens and dozens of things to read about this. But the short version of this is that beginning in the late 11th century, and carrying on into the 12th, and I touched on this a little bit in the lecture on Bibles, the last lecture on Bibles, you have the coalescence of what are called urban schools, major schools or major centers of teaching and inquiry that develop in particular urban centers, principally around cathedral schools, sometimes around monastic schools like St. Victor in Paris, or Notre Dame in Paris, or the Cathedral Church in Chartres, or Reims, or Bologna. So you have these particular regional urban centers that are drawing the attention of masters and theological, legal, medical masters, liberal arts masters in grammar and rhetoric, etc., who are settling in these cities to serve the needs of cathedral schools, and all sorts of students from all over Europe are coalescing around them. Over time and over the course of the 12th century, those developing urban schools wind up realizing they have quite a bit of political and social clout. They recognize that people are gathering for a common purpose, and that it would do well for them to band together to actually secure rights that would help preserve that common purpose and help them develop it further. And as the 12th century progresses, we wind up seeing the emergence of what we now think of as the universities. So Oxford, Salamanca, Bologna, Montpellier, Paris is a big one, especially in terms of the history of book production. So these different locations for formal academic inquiry coincide with, I'd say they help drive, but they're also driven by a desire to wrangle control of a whole bunch of different academic subjects that have gotten out of control over the previous centuries. And what I specifically mean by that, I think, can be illustrated really nicely by the image of an hourglass, which is why I have an hourglass here. So in terms of pastoral care, we really want to focus on the fields of canon law and theology. And prior to the middle portion or the end of the 11th century, we had a system or a situation in both canon law and theology where, from the beginning of the Christian church and the beginning of writings supporting the rise of the Christian church, we had all sorts of people offering up their opinions on every possible matter related to church law, as well as theology. So if we think about that top lobe of an hourglass with all of that sand sitting in it as the pre-12th century period, we have a massive amount of intellectual effort going into writing a whole bunch of different approaches and concepts related to these topics. And what we see as the urban schools start to arise, and as the universities coalesce out of those urban schools, is we see a narrowing of this hourglass down to the neck, down to that middle portion of the hourglass. And that neck is really represented by the process of a number of scholars trying to take control of that massive amount of writing, that massive amount of theorizing that happened during the earlier centuries of Christian intellectual culture, basically. And in the canon law and theology, there were two principal works that emerged that kind of summarize and provide really the apotheosis of these movements. So Gratian's Concordantia Discordantium Canonum, the concordance of discordant canons, it's much better known as the Decretum, was one of these works. And Peter Lombard's 4 books of the sentences, simply and commonly known as the sentences, were the 2 big texts that emerged to kind of wrangle together authoritative and standardized approaches to canon law in Gratian's case, and theology in Peter Lombard's case. And what each of them did is they went back to the people who wrote before them. They went back to all of those texts, stretching back to the patristic period in the very earliest days of the church. And they gathered up authoritative statements about key doctrines and key legal approaches, key theological doctrines and key legal approaches to church governments and the formation of Orthodox thought, basically. What emerged from this practice was a whole mess of opinion, much of it contradicting each other, hence Gratian's original full title for his treatise, The Concordance of Discordant Canons. There was a lot of discordant discourse going on in both law and theology. And what Peter Lombard and Gratian did was put these discordances in dialogue with each other to pick them apart, and then eventually, and through a very concrete process of dialectical or logical discourse, create unified statements that rectified these discordant statements to create a basis that now new theologians and the people who rely, and new canon lawyers, could base their work as time progressed. So we've got that neck for this process. And then the bottom lobe of that, after Peter Lombard and Gratian, both of whose works had been finished and were in full form by the mid-12th century. From that middle portion of the 12th century on through the rest of the Middle Ages, we have that bottom lobe of the hourglass where we have all of the sand hitting that Peter Lombard and Gratian condensation point and then spreading out and blowing up into a whole other series of genres and types of works that emerged because there was now a unified approach to canon law and a unified accepted approach to theology that everyone could agree would form the basis for all future inquiry and all future approaches to both of those topics. So the thing that Gratian's and the Lombards' approach really hinged on was this rediscovery of Aristotle's dialectical method. So I mentioned that they took this logical approach to the way they looked at these discordant statements in theology and law. And this was a fundamental shift in the way that academics went about their work, the way that lawyers and theologians went about their work, and the way that they conceptualized the world around them. So Aristotle's dialectical method was very much rooted on a pro and con approach to a topic. So you would make some sort of thesis statement, you would argue for and against it, you would come up with an opposing thesis statement to that original statement that you came up with based on your pro and con arguments, and then you would repeat the process, pro and con argument again, ultimately arriving at a final conclusion. And so what this dialectical logical method was intended to do was to create a structure whereby you could investigate thoroughly every last component of an issue to come to an understanding that would recognize and address authority while also allowing you to think creatively about how to apply that authority and how to tweak and nuance it to come up with a new authorized, accepted way of thinking about something. So earlier forms of thinking really relied on the Augustinian approach to knowledge. And this is based on the writings of St. Augustine, one of the church fathers. And the Augustinian approach essentially went along the lines of that all knowledge is primarily known through an active dialogue between God and the soul. And this can be boiled down to the quote, "Believe and you will understand." As long as you have faith in God, everything else will become knowable, and it will become knowable through that faith. Aristotle's dialectical method really recovered beginning in the late 11th century from Arabic treatises that had trickled into Western Europe through Spain. The Aristotelian dialectical model really turned this on its head. And rather than insisting on true knowledge being a product of a dialogue between God and the soul, it took the stance that knowledge can be known through direct observation, human experience, and the application of human reason and the rational thought process through a logical dialogue with the natural world. So we can look at the world around us and we can understand it in its own terms. And by using those terms, we can then understand more about the reality that God has created. So that could be summed up essentially by the quote, "Understand and you will believe." So faith is at the heart of one, understanding is at the heart of the other, but they both lead to kind of a similar understanding. So these were not necessarily antithetical ways of approaching the world. There was all sorts of strife, especially in the late 12th and on into the 13th century, where scholars were accused of going too far the direction towards Aristotle and away from Augustine and giving primacy to the thought of Arab scholars or pagan scholars in terms of the ancient Greeks. But really, there were ways to harmonize this. And I won't go into this, but folks like Thomas Aquinas, for instance, through magisterial works like the Catena Aurea, the Golden Chain, or the Summa Theologia, these are a couple of the major works that many of you might have heard of already, would summarize all Christian knowledge through this dialectical method. So we've got, number one, the rise of higher institutions of education, the rediscovery of Aristotle, and then a third catalyst within this development of a new intellectual culture is changes in the use of Latin. So this is a little paradoxical about what I'm about to say, but These changing uses of Latin were both more specialized. What I mean by that is specialized vocabularies for, say, canon law or civil law or theology would develop, and that helped define terms and helped us make sense of things that prior to that were maybe a little muddled and confused. So vocabulary and Latin use became more specialized depending on the genre that you were dealing with. And it also became more simplified because it was often very much, especially when we're talking about pastoral care manuscripts and pastoral care texts like sermons, they were often rooted in more basic common Latin forms that really took on board vernacular qualities of language. So word order might become a little bit more simplified. There was less attention paid in a lot of pastoral care manuscripts to high Latin style that may have come down in intellectual circles from antiquity into the Middle Ages. It was now much more about getting things down and making them intelligible to as wide a readership as possible. So that's revolution or catalyst number one. And right here, I just have a couple pictures that might look familiar to you. Both of these have been featured in in-person sessions in some of our earlier class sessions. But we've got a theological manuscript on the left. This is Peter Lombard's sentences, complete with critical apparatus around it, commentary, footnotes in the margins that are citations to authority. And then on the right, we have the decretum, Gratian's decretum. So this is canon law, and we've got the core text in the middle with commentary nested around it. And this will look very familiar, I'm sure, to the many of the glossed Bible manuscripts that were featured in the Bible lecture. So these reformations really of theology and canon law and the kind of adoption and adaptation of Aristotelian thought led to the emergence of entirely new genres, pedagogical and teaching models, and the manuscripts that supported those that would then in turn support the creation of pastoral care manuscripts of all sorts. So some of these genres, and we're really not going to go into these too much, they included glossae or glosses. So those are like the glossed Bible manuscripts, accepted authorized commentary that would travel very consistently with core texts like Peter Lombard or Gratian. Distinctiones, or collections of vocabulary breakdowns, essentially. And we'll get to that a little bit more specifically later in this lecture, but distinction collections that allowed scholars to define and parse particular vocabulary words or concepts in all sorts of different ways for different applications. Sententiae, or sentence collections. So these would be assemblies of authoritative pronouncements on particular topics. Disputationes, or disputations. So these were recorded either from oral delivery, people copying down the oral delivery of disputations between two or more scholars arguing about a particular point, or it could be a disputation written down by a lone scholar sitting there and working through a thorny theological question. Like one private collector here in Ohio has a collection of disputations, 17 fragments that had been recycled as binding fragments. And the kinds of things that are included in that disputation collection range from questions about the true nature of the body and the blood of Christ in the Eucharist, all the way to questions such as, will giants and monsters be bodily assumed into heaven during the final judgment? So it could be all sorts of different kinds of disputations. Quaestiones collections. These are related to disputations, but they're more formal articulations of these kinds of disputed questions. A question is something that winds up in very, very meticulous format with all sorts of subdivided arguments, pro and con, breaking down in a very schematic way particular questions and outlining how you can work your way through these thorny issues. And then summae could be really anything. A summae could be a collection of all sorts of distinctions. It could be a collection, a massive encyclopedic collection of sentences, disputations, quaestiones, all sorts of things. So moving on, we've got our second primary catalyst for pastoral care revolution, and this was the convening of the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215. This was a major church council that really raised pastoral care, so preaching, confession, liturgical instruction, anything that had to do with religious instruction and passing this knowledge on to layfolk. It raised that to the same level as the liberal arts, medicine, law, theology, and some of the major academic areas of study. It raised pastoral care to that same level, and it provided the impetus to promote the development of formal tools, such as the specialized manuscripts that we've been thinking about this semester and that we have in our collection, in direct support of pastoral care efforts. So the Fourth Lateran Council was a major gathering of over 1,200 abbots, bishops, and major church officials from all over Europe, and they convened in Rome in 1215. And their principal duty was trying to install some reform in the church and to really get under control. One of the main components of this was to get under control a situation that was really spiraling out of control when it came to the provision of pastoral care across a whole bunch of different kind of thematic areas. So the work of this council was to issue a whole series of canons that would help clarify and church practice and codify it and make it standard across all of Europe. I'm not going to go through all of the canons, but there were a number that were particularly important for the pastoral care revolution. The first one was Canon 10 on the institution of preachers. And I'm going to read you some extracts from each of these canons just to give you a sense of what they actually say. What Canon 10 did is it recognized that there was a pronounced need for preachers. In the earlier medieval period, going back to the very earliest days of the church, it was the specific preserve of bishops, high church officials, to do the preaching. As the Middle Ages progressed for a whole variety of reasons that we won't go into here, but you could largely define a lot of the reason for the decline in episcopal or bishops preaching to what we would now call today as administrative creep. Rising demands on bishops' time and effort to being devoted to administrative needs of their diocese as opposed to pastoral care needs. And the Fourth Lateran Council recognized this and tried to get a solution in place. And Canon 10 was meant to address that. And I'll read you an extract from this. So the canon reads, among the various things that are conducive to the salvation of the Christian people, the nourishment of God's word is recognized to be especially necessary, since just as the body is fed with material food, so the soul is fed with spiritual food. It often happens that bishops by themselves are not sufficient to minister the word of God to the people, especially in large and scattered dioceses. We therefore decree by this general constitution that bishops are to appoint suitable men to carry out with profit this duty of sacred preaching, men who are powerful in word and deed and who will visit with care the peoples entrusted to them in place of the bishops, since these by themselves are unable to do it and will build them up by word and example. The bishops shall suitably furnish them with what is necessary when they are in need of it, lest for want of necessities they are forced to abandon what they have begun. We therefore order that there be appointed in both cathedral and other conventual churches suitable men whom the bishops can have as coadjutors and cooperators, not only in the office of preaching, but also in hearing confessions and enjoining penances and in other matters which are conducive to the salvation of souls. If anyone neglects to do this, let him be subject to severe punishment. So there are a couple things to note here. There's a real serious attitude towards this now. That very end, let him be subject to severe punishment if there's a bishop who doesn't provide the means for appointing preachers and getting sermons out there to the masses. But another thing that's really important here is the statement, the bishops shall suitably furnish them with what is necessary. So what this means is bishops need to not only appoint preachers, they need to have an educational structure in place that can help educate potential preachers and help keep them learning, continuing education credits, so to speak, or continuing professional credits that allow existing preachers to better their craft. But in addition to providing preachers, the resources that a bishop is supposed to provide include things like books and manuscripts and the tools that support that education. So Canon 11 follows immediately on this, and it's De Magistris Scholasticis. And this is the decree basically that there should be a theologian in each major metropolitan cathedral or notable church that will teach these priests, as well as others, quote, those things that are known to pertain to the care of souls. And a quick hit from the actual canon on this reads, Zeal for learning and the opportunity to make progress is denied to some through lack of means. This Lateran Council therefore dutifully decrees that in each cathedral church there should be provided a suitable benefice for a master who shall instruct without charge the clerics of the cathedral church and other poor scholars, thus at once satisfying the teacher's needs and opening up the way of knowledge to learners. I'm going to stop the quote here and say that was actually a decree of the Third Lateran Council. The Fourth was reaffirming that, and in the process of Canon 11, recognizing that the Third Lateran Council's original decree had not really been picked up on and it needed to be addressed again. So the quote in Canon 11 continues, "This decree, i.e. the decree from Lateran III, however, is very little observed in many churches. We therefore confirm it here and add that not only in every cathedral church, but also in other churches with sufficient resources, a suitable master elected by the chapter or by the greater and sounder part of it shall be appointed by the prelate or bishop to teach grammar and other branches of study as far as is possible to the clerics of those and other churches." So here's where we have the imposition of a formal expression or a formal demand that there be teaching provided to those who are going to be responsible for the care of souls in particular dioceses and parishes. We then move to canons 14 through 18, and these are a bunch of legalistic canons that help inform expectations for clerical behavior, such as what is allowed with clerics and drinking, what constitutes drunkenness, what constitutes gluttony, what constitutes a breach in decorum of dress, other forms of dissolute behavior, rowdy behavior, morally corrupt behavior. So it addresses these issues, it defines them, and then more importantly, it says this is what's going to happen to those priests who are caught out in this. And the whole principle here is that we can't have priests engaging in this kind of behavior because in pastoral terms, it sets a bad model for all of the people that these priests are supposed to be serving. Canon 21 is arguably the most important one, at least in terms of most modern scholarship. This is the one that a lot of scholars really latch onto when it comes to, if you're going to choose one canon that really decrees pastoral care as a must, it's Canon 21. And this is omnis utriusque sexus, or everyone of both sexes. And this canon basically mandated confession for everyone, whether man or woman, at least one time per year. Usually this fell during Easter for most people. But in order for this confession to actually take place, it necessitated major catechetical instructional reform. So catechetical instruction is the basic teaching of basic Christian principles. So Canon 21, kind of a strung together quote I want to read to you from that, basically says, quote, "All the faithful of either sex, after they have reached the age of discernment, should individually confess all their sins in a faithful manner to their own priest at least once a year, and let them take care to do what they can to perform the penance imposed on them. Otherwise, they shall be barred from entering a church during their lifetime, and they shall be denied a Christian burial at death. Let this salutary decree be frequently published in churches so that nobody may find the pretense of an excuse in the blindness of ignorance. Moreover, the priest shall be discerning and prudent, so that like a skilled doctor, he may pour wine and oil over the wounds of the injured one. Let him carefully inquire about the circumstances of both the sinner and the sin, so that he may prudently discern what sort of advice he ought to give and what remedy to apply, using various means to heal the sick person." So what we have coming out of Canon 21 is a twofold decree. One, for people to give confession, therefore they would need to be educated well enough to give that confession. And then two, for good priests to be conscientious in their duties and educated enough to elicit good confession and to take good confession. At the heart of this canon is spiritual and pastoral education. Moving on to Canon 22, we have a decree that medical doctors need to, in the case of extreme peril of death, they need to first warn their patients that they need to call in doctors of the soul or priests. And a quote from this reads, "As sickness of the body may sometimes be the result of sin, as the Lord said to the sick man whom he had cured, 'Go and sin no more, lest something worse befall you,' so we by this present decree order and strictly command physicians of the body, when they are called to the sick, to warn and persuade them first of all to call in physicians of the soul, so that after their spiritual health has been seen to, they may respond better to medicine for their bodies. For when the cause ceases, so does the effect. Moreover, since the soul is much more precious than the body, we forbid any physician, under pain of anathema, to prescribe anything for the bodily health of a sick person that may endanger his soul. So what this canon does is really prioritize spiritual health over physical health, and it recognizes or basically establishes that much physical health actually is a direct, or physical ailment, I should say, is directly the result of sin and spiritual ailment. It's important then that we call in priests during times of sickness in order to help educate the sick. Again, hearkening back to Canon 21, this kind of work on the priest's part needs to be informed by a good education. And then finally, Canon 27 is the next big one. This one basically decrees that a bishop should instruct prospective priests about the correct celebration of sacraments and rites. And the quote here I want to read out is this: "To guide souls is a supreme art. We therefore strictly order bishops carefully to prepare those who are to be promoted to the priesthood and to instruct them, either by themselves or through other suitable persons, in the divine services and the sacraments of the church, so that they may be able to celebrate them correctly. But if they presume henceforth to ordain the ignorant and unformed, which can indeed easily be detected, we decree that both the ordainers and those ordained are to be subject to severe punishment. For it is preferable, especially in the ordination of priests, to have a few good ministers than many bad ones. For if a blind man leads another blind man, both will fall into the pit." So again, here we have a decree about how important education is and how easy it is to recognize when a priest doesn't have it. So at the heart of all of these decrees, education of the masses, and in order to educate the masses, you have to educate the teachers who are going to teach the masses, the priests. What emerged from the Fourth Lateran Council, as well as the 12th century intellectual advancements that I discussed earlier, was the ground to create a whole new set and a wide set of scholarly tools and administrative directives necessary to develop this basic curriculum of pastoral care that really encompassed everything priests needed to know and needed to teach. So a couple things at the heart of this process, quotes that I really love from Aristotle's Rhetoric. The first one is, "Rhetoric is the counterpart of dialectic." So I talked about dialectic earlier, the logical parsing of complex ideas in order to create something that is more understandable. So we have this dialectical process. This dialectical process was not part and parcel of an everyday Christian's life. Rhetoric was, however. Rhetoric and message and mode of delivery is the way that dialectic and dialectical conclusions were conveyed to the masses. So pastoral care is all about rhetoric. It's all about how that high theological and high philosophical and high legal thought is going to be conveyed to everyday people. The other quote that I like comes out of this Summa of Virtues and Remedies for the Soul, this treatise from the 13th century written by an unknown priest. And that quote is, "Division is the way toward definition." This is a concept that is at the heart of dialectical approaches to breaking down ideas. You need to divide things in order to define them properly. And we see all of this emerge in the course of the 12th and 13th centuries through the formulations of a whole bunch of schematic approaches to basic Christian education. So at the heart of pastoral care are the following things that I've listed here, 1 through 10. We've got the basic prayers and statements. So kind of a media blitz on teaching people the Creed, the Our Father, the Ave Maria. Then we have the breakdown into all sorts of numbered groups of things, core concepts of Christian behavior or Christian concepts of sin. So the 7 gifts of the Holy Spirit, the 4 cardinal virtues, the 3 theological virtues, the 7 deadly sins, the 7 sacraments, the 10 commandments, the 2 commandments of love, the various rewards, and there was no set number for these, the rewards of the body and soul of the just in heaven, and the description of the punishments of the body and the soul of the damned in hell. All of these things provided mnemonic schematics, so ways to break down core concepts of Christian thought and moral behavior, or immoral behavior, broke them down into easily digestible bits that could be defined in small chunks and defined quickly, and then remembered more easily. A lot of this stuff also wound up contributing towards the creation of a body of literature of prescriptive advice about what to avoid and what to do in order to ensure salvation. So the third catalyst for the Pastoral Revolution I want to talk about is the rise of the friars. We've all heard about monks, we've all heard about priests. Parish priests were folks who ministered in churches to particular communities. Monks were communities of professional religious folk who lived apart from society, principally, lived apart from society, and their work was the work of prayer to support the rest of society. In the first quarter of the 13th century, we have a hybrid group of religious people emerge, the friars. And the first two orders of friars, the big ones, were the Franciscans and the Dominicans. And the Franciscans, they followed the model of St. Francis, living according to the dictates of apostolic poverty, and showing by example what true Christian humility was like, and that this is the pathway through poverty and humility towards salvation. The Dominicans, founded by Domingo de Guzman, were much more academic from the get-go. They were very much an order created to actively combat heresy, in particular the Albigensian heresy or the Cathar heresy in southern France, northern Spain, northern Italy, and various other so-called heretical movements or early proto-reform movements like the Valdensians, for instance, in the Alps. But the Dominicans and the Franciscans were founded really as hybrids between what priests do and what monks would do. So they lived a regular life in the same way that monks did. What I mean by that, their pattern of living was dictated by a formal rule that was approved by the Pope. And this rule was a rule for communal behavior. It talked about, these rules would dictate things, for instance, about what property could a friar own or not. Basically, they couldn't own anything except in common as a community. So they lived as a regular community, but they also were able to preach publicly. And eventually they were given the right to hear confessions publicly. So they served the role of a lot of parish priests as well. And then further defining their difference from either parish priests or monks who typically were rooted to a particular spot, parish priests to their church, monks to their monasteries. Dominicans and Franciscans were called mendicants, wanderers. They were given license to travel all over known creation to spread the gospel and to preach. So this group really they slotted into university culture, ultimately really coming to dominate university teaching all over Europe, but really at Oxford, Bologna, and the University of Paris, they had major presences. So they became major theologians who set the stage for pastoral care and set the stage for theological inquiry at the ground level. But they were also practitioners out in the dirt and the fields. They traveled all over. They needed core textbooks. They needed all sorts of ancillary texts to support the work that they did. And this profound shift in the provision of pastoral care, namely these armies of Franciscans and Dominicans wandering all over the known world, preaching, led to the emergence of new ways of thinking about how to package information in manuscripts. And the creation of more modern reference tools and new formats of the book. So a great example of this, harkening back to the lecture on the Bible, would be the Pocket Bible. The whole reason behind the creation of the Pocket Bible, the small format Bible, is in order to create a portable text that would be easy for Dominicans and Franciscans to carry around. In addition to format changes like that, we have the evolution of paratextual elements that help readers navigate texts on the fly and in a consistent fashion from book to book. So some of these paratextual elements that we see really starting to dominate manuscripts across generic boundaries as the Middle Ages progress are things like running titles, those headings at the top of each page that tell you what portion of the text you're in. Marginal apparatus, so citations to authority and footnotes, commentaries, all sorts of things. the widespread adoption of methods for consistent textual division and navigation. So what I mean by this, a good example would be the way the Dominicans devised to divide biblical books and biblical chapters. So verses in Bibles, biblical verses are an invention of the 16th century. Prior to that, in order to create an easy way to navigate and refer to different portions of a biblical chapter, for instance, the Dominicans devised a way where each chapter was divided on the fly roughly into 7 equal sections of length. And then they would just name or label each one of those sections A, B, C, D, E, F, or G. And then they could write in the margins or write in sermon notes or all sorts of other kinds of pastoral things that they worked on. They could write Genesis chapter 17, C. And basically what this would tell someone is they could go to Genesis, that chapter of Genesis, and about 3/7 of the way, they'd have to do some kind of on-the-fly estimation, but about 3/7 of the way through that chapter, they would find the topic that they were looking for, the vocabulary word they were looking for. This seems really, really imprecise, but it was actually remarkably efficient because it doesn't matter how big or small your Bible is. You could be reading out of a giant Bible or out of a pocket Bible or out of a glossed Bible. All you needed to do and know is how big that Bible was and how much space that particular chapter took. And then you just needed to cast off mentally in your own mind's eye what 3/7 of the text would look like and go and find that in that area. So it was a pretty ingenious way of doing things prior to a unified system of versifying the Bible. They did other things and applied similar kinds of methods to other kinds of texts. In addition to that, though, they pioneered the development of tables of contents, the use of subject indices, the creation of concordances. We'll talk a little bit about concordances in a minute. And then also, crucially, the friars were at the foundation of the shift into using alphabetization in indexing and in creating dictionaries. This was a monstrous shift from earlier medieval concepts of how to organize information. So going back to antiquity and the early Christian period, things were organized essentially on their logical interrelationships. So you would think about animals, and then within animals, you would group all the birds together. You would group all the fish. You would group quadrupeds. You would group bipeds. That is a somewhat efficient way of organizing things, but alphabetization is much, much better. It allows you to be very, very precise in a way that, like from text to text, in a way that that kind of logical interrelationship building is not so precise. So alphabetization is a major development. And then also the introduction of Arabic numerals. So using Arabic numerals was another big thing driven by the friars. And the reason that they started importing this, one, they were in very, very close contact with Arabic thought through their work in the universities. So Arabic medical treatises, logical and grammatical treatises, all sorts of things related to the liberal arts and the provision of instruction in dialectical methodology. So they would, and mathematics, of course, arithmetic, and they would come across Arabic numerals and they recognized their utility in very quickly allowing you to divide texts and subdivide them and parse them into smaller and smaller units in a really, really efficient way through the use of Arabic numerals. Also casting off things in line numbers. So for instance, biblical scholars at the University of Oxford started to use Arabic numerals to number off line counts in their Bibles. So they incorporated these numbers to help them navigate texts. So those are the three kind of catalysts. And what I'd like to do for the remainder of this lecture is really look at some of the genres that pastoral care encompasses. And the first one I want to touch on, it's probably one of the most ancient forms of pastoral care genre, is the penitential manual, or as we get into the later medieval period, the confessional manual. Penitentials as a genre emerged in Ireland in the 6th century, moved into Britain in the 7th century, crossed over onto the continent in the 8th century. And this penitential literature was really marking a move from public form, like a confessional model or a penitential model that was built on public forms of penance. So for instance, wearing hair shirts, making public pronouncements at the center of your community of your sin and acknowledging it, going to the church door on Sundays while everyone else is inside the church and begging for forgiveness loudly, public demonstrations of penitential behavior in that way. Penitential manuals reflected kind of a shift from that and more towards a private model of confession and penance. And they started to define what sin was and what the appropriate punishment or restitution for that sin was. As we go through the course of the Middle Ages, this gets more and more complex. And this is directly in line, for instance, with Gratian's decretum and the institution of a formalized system of canon law, where we can start to think in legalistic terms about sin and all of the various different grades. So as the Middle Ages progress and canon law becomes more complex and there's more and more written about it, confessionals expand to not just include lists of sins and then an appropriate list of penances. They also include lists of sins and lists of punishments or restitutions, but also with all of these different gradations or systems of thinking about how to grade and grade different kinds of sin based on the ideas of time, place, measure, quality, quantity, and intention. So let's take, for instance, drunkenness. You get drunk on a Friday night, you go see your priest on a Sunday and you confess this sin about being drunk on Friday. A proper priest in taking confession is going to ask you about time. Not did you do this at 11 p.m., but you did this on Friday. Was Friday a particular feast day? Was it Christmas, for instance? Was it Good Friday? Was it the feast of so-and-so? Committing a sin on particular days like that might then wind up bringing heavier punishment with it. Place. Did you get drunk in church? For instance, did you sneak into the church and drink Eucharistic wine? Did you get drunk on that? Or did you bring beer into a churchyard and did you get drunk in the churchyard? Because getting drunk on hallowed ground in many confessional manuals is much, much more severe than getting drunk at the pub. The measure, how drunk did you actually get? This is important. The quality, what I mean by this and what confessional guides mean by this, what kind of point of view, what kind of attitude underlay you getting drunk? Did you get drunk because you were sad? Did you have a death in the family? Did a relationship end? Did you lose your job? Did you get a bad grade? Or did you get drunk because you were angry? All of these things will help mitigate or accentuate a sin. Quantity, again, here's measure. But in this case, also, he's going to ask that the priest might properly ask, okay, you got drunk on Friday under all of these other circumstances. Do you get drunk every Friday? Did you get drunk on Thursday? Did you get drunk on Saturday? So what is the quantity of your sin? And then ultimately the intention. Was this an unconscious act or was it deliberate? Did you deliberately set out to break a commandment and or to sin and get drunk knowing that it was wrong, or was this an accident because things got out of control? All of these things wind up informing the level of punishment you will get. And this is really, really important for both sides because you don't want to get too heavy a penance as the person doing the restitution. But also, if you're a priest, this is extremely important. A priest needs to know exactly how much penance to impose, because if that priest under imposes a penance on you, you then, as the person making up for the sin, you run a risk of not doing enough to atone for your sin, and you'll wind up in hell. On the other hand, if the priest over-prescribes penance for you, the priest is falling into sin for not doing his job conscientiously and correctly, because you're not supposed to overpay for what sins you've committed. So this is really, really important for both parties, and confessional manuals spell this all out. I'm not going to run through this, but I encourage you to look at this slide in the slides posted on Carmen. And this is a page from James Brundage's monumentally great work on canon law, specifically law and sex in Christian society. And this diagram will outline you through exactly how a priest was supposed to approach a confessional transaction. So, were you feeling randy, or did you have sex on a particular day? And then you have a series of yes and no answers here with all of these conditional questions that a priest would then ask you. And this is actually drawn from a confessional manual that Brundage analyzed. So have a read through that and see exactly how narrow the road to heaven is and how broad the road of sin is in confessional manuals. Another genre will be scholars or preachers' Bibles, and there are all sorts of different shapes this take. There are lots of different tools that can be incorporated into these. So this is an example of a textual or critical Bible tool. What we have here is a page from the Psalms, where on the left we have the Gallican translation of the Psalms, or the Psalms as translated from the Greek version, the Septuagint version. On the right column, we have the Psalms in the Hebrew version or translated from the Hebrew Psalms. And then in the far left, in the margin, we don't have a full version of the Psalms, but we have all sorts of basically vocabulary differences, word choice changes that are represented in the old Roman versions, the old Latin versions of the Psalms. So we have three parallel editions of the Psalms here that a scholar preacher can go to and look at in order to kind of better parse and nuance what the Psalms have to say. So we have textual critical tools. We have distinctiones, and these appear in Bibles like this as marginal commentary. These are the actual jottings of a working Dominican friar, but they could also appear in larger collections like the Codex, the 13th century Codex we have at RBML that consists of about 300 folios of this kind of material, all rendered in very tightly packed prose. And just to give you an example of what a distinction is, distinctiones, as I mentioned earlier, are things that will take an idea or a word and it'll parse them and give them different definitions. So I want to think about the whale from the book of Jonah, the whale that swallows Jonah. So a distinction collection or a distinction schematic diagram like you see here that might consider the word whale would offer a whole slew of different definitions. So on the one hand, whale equals a big fish. And under a different lens, the whale as Leviathan equates to Satan. The whale can also serve as an image or representation of a church or a cathedral. In the case of Jonah, for instance, Jonah is swallowed by a whale and he meditates on his sin and he prays to God within the whale. So the whale becomes a form of church or cathedral. The whale is also described in some distinction collections as a vehicle. Literally a vehicle for God's will. So in the case of Jonah, Jonah is swallowed by the whale for his disobedience because God tells him to go preach in Nineveh. Jonah doesn't want to do that because he's afraid he's going to get killed by the people there if he does do that. The whale swallows Jonah, and then while Jonah is in the belly of the whale for 3 days, the whale swims far enough to deposit Jonah out on the beach not far from Nineveh. So the whale is a vehicle. It's a vehicle of God's will, and it's a literal vehicle. And then finally, the whale is hell. So Jonah has sinned in his disobedience, and he is now sitting in hell. So a distinctions collection might take a single word like whale and illustrate it in all of those different ways and provide in one handy location all these different definitions for a preacher to kind of pick and choose from. We also have glossaries, like the interpretation of Hebrew names. And I mentioned this to all of you in our in-person session a couple weeks ago. This is basically just a list of personal and proper names in Hebrew and Aramaic, and it provides a literal definition. This word means like lily, or Susan, Susanna, for instance, means lily or flower. And then it'll provide an allegorical meaning for that so that preachers can use those things. We also have concordances, and the concordance is a paratext. It's essentially an index. So the word fear, I hit on that earlier in talking about distinctions. Jonah being afraid of getting killed in Nineveh. You might want to look up the word fear in a concordance, and it's going to list all of the places in the Bible, book and chapter, where you might find fear addressed. And the first concordances really didn't emerge until the early 1240s, and they were a direct process of Dominican thinking. They were actually, the biblical concordance was invented at the Dominican Friary of Saint Jacques in Paris. There were 3 different recension efforts that happened, or three different kind of versions that were developed over the course of 40 or 45 years, all of them in Paris, that resulted in the kind of concordance that we now take for granted today, and the kind of concordance that I, for instance, heavily relied upon in my own dissertation research on the theology of fear all those years ago when I did that project. So concordances allow quick and easy access, vocabulary access to the Bible. And then we have biblical florilegia, and this is kind of like a concordance, but also offering a little bit of context. And this is an example of the Flores Bibliae of Nicholas de Hanapis, an epitome of it, or a shortened version of his longer text that we have here at Ohio State. And an example of how this might work, here is the entry in the Flores for the term lust. And so we have lust here, and a few of these entries, for instance, this top one, it says that lust was the cause of Noah's flood, or was the cause of the great flood. This can be found in Genesis 6. Other entries say in Judith chapter 20, it is read that 25,000 men died on account of lust. And then there's the very last one, de filialibus loth, Genesis 19. So on the daughters of Lot. So Sodom and Gomorrah is destroyed. Lot and his family flee. His wife looks back and is turned into a pillar of salt. Lot and his daughters get away and hide in the hills above Sodom and Gomorrah. And in that process, Lot's daughters, thinking that they're the last three people alive on the planet, seduce their father, thinking that they need to repopulate the earth. So in this case, this tool is referring to that instance as an example of lust that a preacher could turn to in order to illustrate the sermon. Another genre that we've got are devotional handbooks, catechetical manuals, and even popular poetry that does this kind of work that outlines basic elements of the Christian faith. And these kinds of texts really show how high Latin thought and high Latin concepts of theology and moral theology trickle down to everyday people. So we'll see things like the 10 Commandments explained here, the necessary prayers like the Ave and the Creed, articles of faith, moral teaching on the vices and the virtues, the corporal acts of mercy, the days of doom. A great example of how this works in really a popular culture sort of way I've got pictured here. This is from one of my churches, favorite churches in the city of York in Northern England. This is called the Prick of Conscience window, and it's an early 15th century window that is based on a very, very popular poem surviving in over 105 manuscripts today called The Prick of Conscience in Middle English. It was a 14th century poem that remained popular throughout the rest of the Middle Ages. And it has a section on the 15 days of doom. And in this church, All Saints North Street, patrons, parishioners in that church and patrons of that church gave enough money to create this stained glass window outlining the 15 days of doom. And they commissioned a manuscript copy of the Prick of Conscience that was kept on a pedestal or on a lectern right next to this window. And so we have here an example of how high moral theological teaching on sin and damnation and doomsday and apocalyptic theology, how thinking in that area trickles down into pastoral care in the vernacular, in Middle English, into a manuscript that more people would be able to read, and then into a form, a visual form, an artistic form that would have made that teaching even more accessible to all sorts of people, to a non-literate group of people, in fact. And what's really great about this, you can see in the image on the left, you've not only got a visual representation of a scene of one of these days of doom, but we also have the Middle English text of the Prick of Conscience rendered in the stained glass. So you could easily imagine a parishioner who can read, possibly reading out of the Prick of Conscience or reading the Prick of Conscience's lines on the window itself while pointing out the images to family or friends. Then we have homilies and sermons. And homilies and sermons are basically, they do the same thing. They're religiously themed teaching messages presented by priests or bishops or monks or any professional church person. But really the difference between them, homilies were more of an ancient and early medieval way of delivering a religious message. Usually it would start with some sort of quote. It could be short or longer from the Bible. followed by informal discourse. So it'd be oral commentary tied to that Bible. And then moreover, these homilies would be tied to certain liturgical themes or certain liturgical times of the year. So during Easter, you're going to have all sorts of more free-form kind of homilies that'll take a longer passage of the Bible, read out that, and then provide this running narrative, sometimes with fun stories, but really a text or a delivery that explicates that biblical reading in light of the time of year that it is. Beginning in the 12th century and then really getting perfected in the 13th century, though, we have an entirely new form of sermon that's developed, and it's called the modern or the textual sermon. I'm going to break that down for you in a minute, but by the time we get to this later medieval period, not only are sermons hyper-engineered, and you'll see that hyper-engineering in a second, they can also be parsed into 4 basic types of sermons. We have sermones de sanctis, or for saints. So sermons dedicated to particular saints to be used on particular saints' feast days. Sermones de tempore, or temporal sermons. These are like a lot of the homilies from the earlier period. These will be sermons that are tied to particular times of year. So sermons that are built in order to teach messages related to Advent, to Easter, to Pentecost, to Lent, to various seasons of the church year. Sermones de ocasione, or occasional sermons. So sermons that are written specifically in conjunction with, say, the event of a coronation, someone's death, someone becoming ordained as a priest, a sermon given when a young woman is conferred into a convent or a nunnery, a sermon on the birth of the heir of a king. So those are occasion sermons. And then sermones ad status, and these are sermons dedicated to particular types of people. These are the rarest form of later medieval sermons. And these ad status sermons are things like sermons for kings, sermons for monks, sermons for merchants, sermons for scholars. All of these do exist, and they're very, very fascinating as social historical pieces. But to get back to kind of how modern and textual sermons are divided and organized, it's very, very particular. They all begin with a theme or a scriptural text. And this can be an entire chapter and verse from a biblical book, like we've got here from Matthew 10:28. I'll let you guys read that. So you have the establishment of the theme for that sermon. In this case, what fear is proper? Worldly fear or spiritual fear? With that as our theme, the preacher then moves into a section called the pro-theme or the antitheme. So he clarifies his intent. He might reaffirm that theme. He'll reaffirm it usually with a prayer, and then he attempts to, in quote, win over the audience. And sometimes this is doing so with a brief personal story that applies somehow to that theme. So in this case, maybe the priest is relating a story about how he himself was faced with a choice that hinged on whether he was more afraid of temporal loss, so say losing an investment of money, as opposed to, say, if he had done something untoward or something sinful in order to hold on to that investment and to get a better return on that cash investment. If he had chosen to do that, but did so in a sinful way, he chose to fear losing worldly goods more than he chose to fear damnation and the loss of spiritual good. So he might, say, share a story like that in order to win over the audience. Then he'll go through major divisions, and these divisions are usually confirmed by authorities. So it'll be as Augustine says, as Thomas Aquinas says, as this book of the Bible says, and then he'll follow up with kind of something that reaffirms the theme. Then there will be subdivisions that divide the larger divisions into socii, or parts, allies, using things like amplification and dilation. And there are a whole bunch of tools that a preacher could use to do this. Definition and counter definition. This is where using things like the interpretation of Hebrew names might come in. So we're going to define our terms. We're going to define what those terms are not, and we're going to have a discussion about those things. Citation of authorities. So we've already done that in the division process, but the priest might want to continue doing that in order to flesh out his sermon. A really popular one was using an explication of the 4 senses of Scripture. These were the literal sense, the allegorical sense, tropological sense, and anagogical sense. And to stay on kind of the book of Jonah as an example of what these were, Let's think about Jonah being swallowed by the whale. In the literal sense, this happened. The Bible is history. It's understood as real history during the Middle Ages. Everything in it happened exactly the way it happened. So on the one hand, Jonah being swallowed by the whale is a literal retelling of a historical event. However, it is also a literal manifestation of God's power and his mastery over the natural universe. An allegorical meaning of Jonah being swallowed by the whale would be a prefiguration of Christ's death and his descent into hell for a period of 3 days, and his harrowing of hell, his releasing of the justified sinners from hell. And this was an extremely popular allegorical interpretation during the Middle Ages of what Jonah's swallowing by the whale meant. The tropological sense is basically the moral sense of how you would read something. So Jonah being swallowed by the whale in moral terms is a simple punishment being meted out for his disobedience of God. And then the anagogical sense was basically an interpretation that incorporated an understanding of what something meant in relation to the world after death, or your own status after you die. So Jonah being swallowed by the whale is a direct representation of the eternal fate of anyone who disobeys God and remains persistent in that disobedience. So a priest might break apart his divisions into those subdivisions in order to help kind of define the terms of his theme. And then also another common way would be the use of exempla. And these are entertaining moral stories. They could be Bible stories, extracts from saints' lives. It could be fables, folklore, literature. They even incorporate songs and lyrics. It could be you taking information from natural philosophical treatises like lapidaries or books all about stones, and taking data that's presented in those scientific treatises and incorporating that to talk about, a piece of slate is equatable to this, that, or the other thing, or it emphasizes the following theological or embodies the following theological point. So exemplar are all sorts of illustrative moral things that also provide some entertainment during the sermon. And then we have ultimately, after the subdivisions, the priest needs to draw, or the preacher needs to draw everything together, and we have the conclusion with a restatement of the initial theme, an eschatological statement, or basically a statement that provides a warning about how this theme applies to eternity and applies to the end of the world and your own situation in eternity after the end of the world. And then a concluding closing prayer. So lots of preachers during this period would conceptualize this structure as a preaching tree. And this is a great mnemonic today to remember this by. The theme equals the roots, the protheme and antitheme is the trunk, the divisions are the main branches, the subdivisions are the smaller twigs and branches, and then the conclusion are the leaves and the fruit that spring from these subdivisions. Really, really nice rendering of the structure. So sermon manuscripts. We have lots of these at Ohio State, and there are literally thousands of these that still survive today all around the world. And they're fantastic encapsulations of pastoral care. But a big thing to remember about these is that they are, and I want to really stress this by reading my quote here, they're static representations of a dynamic mode of communication and performance. What I mean by that is we have no way of knowing what preaching actually sounded like or looked like in the Middle Ages because we couldn't record video or audio. So preaching is largely a component of pastoral care that in many ways is still a mystery, but we have all sorts of manuscript survivals that show us at least from one remove, or at least one remove, what preaching may have looked like. And so the typical kinds of sermon collections you will find are what are called reportationes. So these are reportations. These will be copies of sermons or versions of sermons. They might be complete. Usually they're somewhat abbreviated, but they would be like you copying down what I'm lecturing on right now, and that becomes the record of my lecture, your notes. That's a reportation. So we have sermons that survive as recountings of people who heard those sermons. We then have skeletal outlines or prompts. So taking that structure that I just outlined, the preaching tree, when we get to the divisions and subdivisions, for instance, a lot of sermon manuscripts would package an individual sermon and not flesh out all of those, but in shorthand list what the divisions might be and where you might find more information about those divisions, but it's not going to write the whole thing out for you. Then we have model sermon collections, and that's putting down an entire sermon. Very often this is a truly literary production. This is fully formed, finished sermons. They're rhetorically perfect, or final drafts, so to speak. And then we have expanded sermons, and these might be sermons that are like model sermons, but they've been fleshed out in direct response to notes taken and presented through reportation sermon collections. So the two pieces that I have pictured here, on the left we have an example of an expanded sermon or a model sermon. This is sermon 33 from Johannes Herolt's Sermones de Tempore. Long, you can see how long that is, and it continues on to the back of this page. So this full sermon takes up about a page and a half, or 3 columns of text. Then in the right image, if you see every rubricated, 2-line rubricated initial, that begins a new sermon. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 sermons almost entirely packaged here over the course of these 2 pages. This is either a reportation manuscript where someone has just jotted down and then done so in a finalized way. This is not, working notes. This is a formal book that could have been produced from reportation notes. Or it's a manuscript that preserves skeletal outlines or sermon prompts. And this is one of those that does exactly what I described a few seconds ago, which is it lists, beginning with the rubricated initial. We start out with our biblical theme, and then after that, it kicks it out into the various divisions, and each one of them says primo, secundo, tertio, or in primo, in secundo, in tertio, and then it provides little references to citation, but it has no actual discourse in there or no narrative. It incorporates no exempla. So it's just giving a reader or a preacher the basic outline for sermons. Then we have a broad genre of things called the ars predicandi, the art of preaching. These kinds of manuscripts can include a whole bunch of things, like exempla collections, just compilations of useful exempla, model and abbreviated sermon collections, dictionaries, encyclopedias, epitomes. Epitomes are basically abbreviated versions of longer texts, florilegia, which are manuscripts that gather all sorts of authoritative, topical, or useful statements from all sorts of different sources. So one of our manuscripts, Codex 2, is called the Faretra. Literally, that means the quiver, or a quiver of arrows. And so a florilegium is a treatise that captures all sorts of arrows, rhetorical arrows and textual arrows that the preacher could string on his bow and fire at parishioners, so to speak. It's a 1-volume library. And then manuals of advice, the artes predicandi, and these are essentially the idiot's guide to preaching. So these things not only could incorporate any of the above topics, dictionaries, florilegia material, things like that, but it also provides priests with advice about how to behave, how to dress, how to stand, how to modulate their voice, and how to make it, soft and loud for dramatic effect, things like that. Organizational prompts on how to structure their sermons, suggested resources to turn to. One of my favorite that is often referred to in the later Middle Ages is a book called the Dormi Secure, or the Sleep Securely, which is a collection of model sermons that lazy priests, this is actually said in the introduction to that treatise, that lazy priests or uneducated priests could turn to in order to crib entire sermons, thereby allowing them to sleep securely and without the fear of not having a sermon to relate to their parishioners. And how to address different audiences, things like that. So this is a really, really broad set of things. One of the types of things that's included in these will be advice like the following, or short little snippets or exempla like the following. And I love this one. So this is from a 13th century collection. And the quote just reads, "Remember blessed Francis, Saint Francis, who when a certain man asked him for edifying words answered, quote, 'Brother Lamb says nothing but bah. Therefore, think benignly, speak benignly, and act benignly, and you shall be saved.'" This is the kind of hokey but funny stuff, and very, very useful and clever stuff that a lot of these kinds of preaching and pastoral manuals incorporated. It's easily memorable. It might get a laugh out of your crowd. I doubt any of you laughed at my attempt to sound like a sheep. But it gives you a sense of the kinds of things that are packaged here. So it's not just high Latin thought. It's not just high structured church thought. It's all of that, but it's packaged and developed in a way that is meant to be appealing to a wider audience. We also then have pastoral manuals, and pictured here are 2 openings from the Ocula Sacerdotis manuscript here at OSU. These could incorporate any or all of the above topics from the previous slide. They're one-stop shops for priests. They provide confessional, preaching, catechetical, sacramental information, etc. The Ocula Sacerdotis specifically includes and is divided according to 3 parts. The right part of the eye, which is catechetical material and preaching guidelines. The left part of the eye, which is all about sacramental theology, so describing the 7 sacraments and why they're important and how to confer those rights on parishioners and the people in their care. And then the part of the eye. And this is guidelines for confessional practice. So real practical advice on how to take confession. So you've got pastoral manuals like that. And then we have manuals, or a manuale, the priest's manuale. And these are handbooks. These provide the basic script that a priest would need, not for conducting things like the Mass, but the basic scripts that a priest needed to confer the sacraments. And this is a page from a recently acquired manuscript by a private collector in Delaware, Ohio, from circa 1400 German priest's manuale. And this particular page preserves text from the order of baptism. So it instructs, the rubrics instruct the priest on what to do and when to do it. And then this text is what would be read out. So this is for baptism, but I also put in parentheses and exorcism, because beginning with the rubricated initial here, this text is preserved depending on which manuale tradition you look at, for either the 2nd or the 3rd exorcism that is part of the baptismal process. And this is basically exorcising the water that is used to baptize the infant. And this portion of a priest's manuale also was occasionally used, or could be used, to perform other kinds of exorcisms, or exorcisms of evil spirits and exorcisms of the devil at non-baptismal moments. So priest's manuales were very important and very, very common as well. And then finally, a very atypical kind of pastoral care manuscript that I really wanted to bring your attention: library catalogs. Medieval library catalogs, going back into the earlier period and on up through the High Middle Ages, principally were book lists. That's all they were. This cathedral or this monastery has the following books. Occasionally, it would provide directional reference. It can be found on this shelf. In the 14th century, though, library catalogs start to take on additional import. And the best example of this is a tool called the Registrum Angliae that was compiled by the Franciscan order in England. And what this is really the Western world's first attempt at a union catalog, a single catalog that collects information about the holdings of all of the Franciscan libraries around England. And the reason this was done, as I mentioned way far back at the beginning, or towards the beginning of this lecture when we were talking about the friars were mendicant orders. So the Franciscans in this case, they were mendicant, they wandered. So they traveled around, in this case, England, to do their jobs, to preach to the masses. As they traveled, they had access to all of these different Franciscan establishments around the country. And what the Registrum Angliae does is it captures the contents of the libraries of all of the Franciscan organizations around England. This particular manuscript copy of the Registrum preserves the titles of 1,412 different works. And the reason this is important is that in the performance of their, say, sermon writing duties, they might want to have access to certain kinds of texts. And they know that, for instance, they're coming up on the town of Bristol. If they knew they were going to be traveling to Bristol, but they're in York at the moment, and York has a copy of the Registrum, they could look at that copy of the Registrum and see what Bristol has, in order to help prepare them for the kind of work that they might want to do or the kind of reference work they might want to do. So in this way, a library catalog really provides backbone kinds of information for the pastoral work that friars are going to do in this case. But usually the friars' libraries were also open to other working priests and other theologians and scholars wherever these libraries were. So it is possible that other folks could have had access to these as well in order to help support their own pastoral and scholarly works. So not a lot of people think about later medieval library catalogs as pastoral works, but we should all think of them as such. And my final slide here is just for your own reference, a short list of the basic kinds of texts that serve the art of preaching. So these are all different pastoral care manuscript texts. And I now want to conclude this lecture. I've kept your attention and your time for long enough, and I will stop here, and we will all have a chance to take a look at both Bible manuscripts and pastoral care manuscripts in conjunction in our next in-person session. So please contact me if you have any questions about pastoral care manuscripts, about the Bible manuscripts. You may have been able to tell with both of these lectures, I love both of these topics. Also, they're monster topics. There's so much to cover, it's impossible to do in one sitting. So please get in touch if you have any questions. I would love to talk to you about these different genres. All right, thanks very much.